Chapter 1. The Long Way Home. The rain began, as it always seemed to in Clara Whitcomb's life, at precisely the wrong moment. She had made it 104 miles from London without incident, through the grey sprawl of the suburbs, past Oxford's dreaming spires half hidden in mist, and up into the folded green country where the road narrowed and the hedgerows rose like walls on either side. Then, 3 miles from the village of Nether Wyckham, with the removal van's sat-nav announcing smugly that she had nearly arrived, the sky opened. It was not gentle English drizzle. It was the kind of rain that fell as though the heavens had been saving it up for a special occasion, hammering the windscreen so hard that the wipers gave up any pretense of usefulness. And it was in that blinding downpour, on a lane scarcely wider than the van itself, that Clara rounded a bend and found the road entirely occupied by sheep. 40 of them, at least, perhaps 400. In the rain and the failing October light, it was impossible to say. They flowed around the van like a woolly grey river, entirely unbothered, while somewhere in the murk a dog barked twice, sharp, businesslike, and a man's voice called out something she couldn't hear. Clara put her head against the steering wheel and laughed, because the alternative was to cry, and she had done quite enough of that in the past 6 months to last her the rest of her natural life. Lord, she thought, in the half-praying, half-arguing way that was all she had managed since the spring. If this is your idea of a welcome, I'd like to register a complaint. A knock at the window made her jump. Through the streaming glass, she could make out a man, tall, hatless, dark hair plastered flat, wearing a waxed jacket that had clearly lost its argument with the weather some time ago. She cranked the window down 2 inches and was rewarded with a face full of rain. "You'll want to back up," the man said. Not hello, not sorry about the sheep, just that, in a low Gloucestershire burr, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Back up," Clara repeated. On this road, in a 7.5-ton van. "There's a gateway 30 yards behind you. They'll not go round you here. The banks are too high, and Bess can't push them past a great wall of a van in the dark." He wiped water from his eyes with the back of his wrist. It didn't help. 2 minutes, and you'll be on your way. And if I can't reverse 30 yards down a flooded lane in the dark? Something that might, in better light, have been amusement crossed his face. "Then I expect you'll learn." Clara stared at him. In London, she had spent 7 years managing acquisitions for one of the largest publishing houses in Britain. She had negotiated with agents who ate junior editors for breakfast. She had once made a best-selling novelist cry, entirely by accident, and then talked him back into his contract over lunch. She was not accustomed to being told by soaking wet strangers that she would learn. She learned. It took closer to 10 minutes than 2, and she clipped the gatepost once, and the man stood in the rain the entire time, one hand raised, guiding her back inch by inch with a patience that was somehow more infuriating than shouting would have been. When the van was finally tucked into the gateway, the sheep poured past in a bleating tide, the dog, a black and white collie, low and quick, sweeping behind them like a shadow. The man paused at her window as the last of the flock went by. Up close, and with the worst of the rain easing, she could see he was perhaps 35, weathered in the way of men who spent their lives out of doors, with eyes the grey-green of the hills behind him. "You'll be the new one at the bookshop then," he said. "Beatrice's niece." Clara blinked. "Great niece. How on earth did you—" Removal van, London plates, weak the shop changer's hands. He shrugged, and rain sluiced off his shoulders. "Nether Wyckham's not a large place. You'll find that out soon enough." He stepped back and whistled once. The dog wheeled to his side. "Mind the ford at the bottom of Church Lane. It'll be running high tonight." And then he was gone, swallowed up by the rain and the dusk and the sound of his sheep. And Clara sat in her borrowed van in a stranger's gateway and thought, not for the first time, that she had made either the best or the worst decision of her life, and that it was far too late to tell which. The village of Nether Wyckham, when she finally reached it, was doing its best to look like the front of a biscuit tin, even in the rain. Golden stone cottages leaned companionably against one another along a single winding street. A humpbacked bridge crossed the little river Wyle, which was indeed running high, brown and urgent beneath the arches. The Church of St. Mary's stood on its rise at the top of the green, its square Norman tower a darker shape against the darkening sky, and light glowed amber in the windows of the Wheatsheaf Inn. And there, halfway along the high street between the post office and a shuttered butcher's shop, was the lantern. Clara parked the van and simply looked at it for a long moment through the rain-streaked glass. The shop's bow window was dark, its gilt lettering. The lantern. Books, new and old, Est. 1962, flaking at the edges. A carriage lamp hung over the door, unlit. Great-aunt Beatrice had lit it every evening for 50 years, rain or shine, war or peace. So the lost can find their way to a good book, she used to say, which is very nearly the same as finding their way home. Beatrice had been dead 8 weeks. The lamp had been dark for 8 weeks, and Clara, who had not set foot in Nether Wyckham for nearly 6 years, had inherited the whole improbable thing: shop, stock, flat above, debts, leaking roof, and all, in a will that had contained exactly one line addressed to her personally. To my great-niece Clara, who has forgotten what she loves, I leave the means of remembering. She had read that line in a solicitor's office in Cheltenham 3 days after her wedding was meant to have happened, wearing a coat she'd bought for a honeymoon she would never take. And she had laughed then too, that same laugh that lived next door to weeping. The key was old brass, heavy as a promise. The lock resisted, then gave. The door opened on darkness and the smell of 10,000 books, paper and dust and old leather and something underneath it all that was simply Beatrice. Lavender water and pipe smoke, for her great-aunt had smoked a pipe with magnificent unconcern for anyone's opinion, including her doctor's. Clara stood on the threshold with the rain at her back, and the grief she had been outrunning for 2 months caught her up all at once. "Oh, Auntie B," she said to the dark shop, "what am I supposed to do now?" The shop, being a shop, did not answer. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw that someone had been in, recently. The post had been stacked neatly on the counter rather than drifting behind the door. A bucket stood under the known leak by the theology section, emptied and reset. And on the counter, weighted down by a smooth river stone, was a note in a strong, upright hand. Roofs held so far, but the flashing wants seeing to before winter. Buckets under the usual spot. Your aunt's accounts are in the green ledger, second drawer, and I'd look at them sooner than later if I were you. The lamp oil is under the stairs. A. Brier, Hartsfoot Farm. P.S. She was the finest woman in 3 parishes, and we none of us said it to her often enough. Clara read the note twice. Then she went and found the lamp oil under the stairs and a box of long matches, and she went out into the last of the rain and lit the carriage lamp over the door of the lantern for the first time in 8 weeks. The flame caught, steadied, and held. Warm light spilled across the wet pavement and the golden stone. Somewhere up the dark hill behind the village, she supposed, a man called A. Brier was getting his sheep in, soaked to the bone, having stopped on some earlier evening to empty a dead woman's bucket and stack a dead woman's post. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart," Clara said softly. It was the verse the vicar had read at Beatrice's funeral, Psalm 34, and it had made her angry at the time, because her heart was broken twice over, and the Lord had felt very far away indeed. It made her a little less angry now, standing in the lamplight. Not much, but a little. It was, she would think much later, the first small mercy of Nether Wyckham. It would not be the last. Chapter 2. The Green Ledger. The green ledger, when Clara found it in the second drawer, was not encouraging reading. She sat at the shop counter on her first full morning in Nether Wyckham, a mug of tea going cold at her elbow, and pale October sunlight slanting through the bow window, and worked her way through her great-aunt's accounts with a mounting sense of vertigo. Beatrice had kept the books in the same beautiful copper-plate hand for half a century, and the numbers told a story as clear as any novel on the shelves. A shop that had thrived, then held steady, then quietly, gently, gracefully begun to sink. There was money owed to suppliers. There was a loan against the building itself, taken out 4 years ago, for the roof, Clara guessed, or the rewiring, or one of the 100 hungry mouths an old building opens every winter. There was a folder of letters from a firm called Halloran and Vane, Property Development, each one offering to purchase the freehold of numbers 14 through 22, the High Street, Nether Wyckham, the whole terrace, shop and post office and empty butchers and all, and each one politely, firmly, magnificently unanswered. The most recent letter was dated 3 weeks after Beatrice's death. It was addressed to the executors of the estate of Miss B. Whitcombe, and the offer had gone up. Clara was still staring at it when the shop bell rang. The woman who came in was somewhere north of 70, dressed in a quilted jacket and a headscarf patterned with pheasants, and she was carrying a Victoria sponge on a plate the way a herald carries a banner. "You'll be Clara," she announced. "I'm Margaret Pruitt. Peggy. I do the flowers at St. Mary's and the teas for the bell ringers, and I've been watching for your lights since Tuesday. That's for you." The sponge landed on the counter with ceremonial finality. "You've your aunt's chin. Now, what do you know about the harvest supper?" Nothing at all," Clara admitted. "I only arrived last night." "Well, it's a fortnight Saturday in the church hall, and Beatrice always did the bookstall and the readings, and I don't see why death should interrupt a perfectly good tradition, do you? She wouldn't stand for it, so you'll do it." Peggy paused, and her bright bird's eyes softened. "That is, we'd be very glad if you would, dear. She talked about you, you know. My Clara, she'd say, is wasted on London, word for word." Clara looked down at the ledger full of sinking numbers, and the letter from Halloran and Vane, and then at the Victoria sponge, which was still slightly warm. "I'd be honoured," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Peggy stayed 40 minutes, drank 2 cups of tea, and delivered, with footnotes, the entire recent history of the parish. Clara learned that the vicar, the Reverend Thomas Milton, was a lamb, but woolly, if you take my meaning, needs feeding up. That the post office was run by the Chandra family, the daughters at Cambridge were all sick with pride, that the wheat sheaf did a respectable pie, and that the butchers had closed in the spring when old Mr. Fox retired, which is when those Halloran people started circling, like they can smell it, empty windows, like flies. "And Hartsfoot Farm?" Clara asked as casually as she could manage. "A Mr. Brier?" "Adam." Peggy's teacup paused halfway to her mouth, and something passed across her face, the particular carefulness of a village that knows all its own wounds. "Churchwarden, though you'd have to hold him down to make him admit it. Farms the hill above the village, same as his father and grandfather. He looked in on your aunt every week at the end, you know. Brought her eggs, read to her when her eyes went. Job mostly, she liked Job. Said it was the only book in the Bible with a proper sense of humour about suffering." Peggy set the cup down. "He lost his wife, dear. Emily. 3 years gone this Advent. So we don't chivvy him, and he doesn't come to the suppers, and that's the shape of it." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I didn't know." "No reason you should." Peggy gathered her coat and her empty plate bag and paused at the door. "He'll be up your ladder before the month's out, mind. He promised Beatrice about that roof, and Adam Brier's promises are like the wile in flood, slow to start, but nothing on earth stops them once they're moving." The bell rang her out into the street, and rang again, as she put her head back in. Church is at 10 Sunday. Beatrice's pew is third from the front on the pulpit side. It's yours now if you want it. Clara had not decided, until that exact moment, whether she was going to go to church in Nether Wyckham. Her faith over the past 6 months had been less a rock and more a rope bridge in a high wind, still attached at both ends, she supposed, but she had stopped trusting it with her full weight around the time James had stood in her flat with his suitcase already packed and explained, in the reasonable tones he used on underperforming assets, that he had prayed about it, and he really felt that God was releasing him from the engagement. Released. As though she were a fish. As though the Almighty ran a catch-and-return scheme for men who had found someone newer. The worst of it, the part she had never said aloud to anyone, was not losing James. She could see now, at 100 miles distance, the man he had actually been, as opposed to the man he performed. The worst of it was that he had used the language of her faith to do it, prayed over her like a property deal, and something in her had not been able to say the words Lord and love in the same sentence since without tasting ash. "Third pew from the front," she said to the empty shop. "Pulpit side." She went back to the green ledger, but first she moved the letter from Halloran and Vane to the bottom of the drawer, underneath the paper clips, where it could think about what it had done. Adam Brier came about the roof on Thursday. Clara was up a stepladder in the poetry section when the bell rang, and by the time she had extracted herself, he was already standing in the middle of the shop with his cap in his hands, looking around at the shelves the way other men look at a church. In dry clothes and daylight, he was less like a figure out of a hardy novel, and more simply a large, quiet man, taking up slightly more room than he knew what to do with. Sandy brown hair pushed back off his forehead, that same weather in his grey-green eyes. "Miss Whitcombe." "Mr. Brier." She came down the ladder. "Thank you for the note, and the bucket, and the lamp oil, and, I gather, 3 years of eggs, and the Book of Job." The tips of his ears went faintly red. She'd have done the same for anyone. "She'd have done it once for anyone," Clara said. "Weekly is another thing altogether." He turned his cap over in his hands. He had, she noticed, the hands of a man who mended things, scarred across the knuckles, a fresh sticking plaster on one thumb. "I've come to look at the flashing, before the weather turns proper, if it's convenient." "It's leaking into the theology section, Mr. Brier. It's extremely convenient." And there, brief, reluctant, real, was the thing she'd half seen in the rain. A smile that started in his eyes a full second before it reached his mouth, as though it had to travel a long way from wherever he kept it. "Aye, well," he said. "Even the rain has opinions about theology. Where's your ladder?" He was on the roof for 2 hours. Clara sold 1 paperback thriller and a birthday card, served tea to 2 ramblers who had mistaken the shop for a cafe and been too embarrassed to leave, and tried very hard not to keep glancing up at the ceiling, following the unhurried sounds of a man doing a thing properly. When he came down, he washed his hands at her kitchen sink without being asked. Farm manners, she would learn, where you never trailed the outdoors through anyone's house, and accepted a mug of tea and stood drinking it by the counter while the light went long and gold up the high street. "It'll hold till spring," he said. "It wants re-leading after that. I'll speak to Davy Fox, the butcher's boy that was. He does the church roof, he'll not rob you." He hesitated, and she watched him decide something. "You've found the green ledger, then?" "I've found it," Clara said. "It's a gripping tragedy in 5 acts." "She'd not sell to them," he said. "Halloran's people. They came to me first, 2 years back. My bottom field runs behind that terrace, and they can't get their access road without it. 40 houses they want. Executive homes." He said the words the way another man might say foot rot. "I told them no, and Beatrice told them no, and between the 2 of us the whole scheme's been stuck fast ever since." He set down the mug and looked at her, direct as weather. They'll come to you now. I thought you should hear it plain from someone before you hear it sideways from everyone. And you're wondering what I'll say to them. It's your shop, Adam said. It's your aunt's life's work, and your roof, and your debt, and I've no right to wonder anything. He picked up his cap. But I'm wondering. Clara looked at him, this man who emptied buckets for the dead and read Job to the dying, and found she wanted, quite badly, for him to think well of her, which was inconvenient and alarming and would need to be examined later in a well-lit room. My aunt left me one sentence in her will, Mr. Brier, she said. She said she was leaving me the means of remembering what I love. I don't think she meant for me to sell the means to Halloran and Vane. He nodded once, slowly, the way she imagined he nodded at a sky that had decided not to storm after all. At the door he paused, cap in hand. Adam, he said, if you're stopping. Clara, she said, I'm stopping. The bell rang him out. Through the bow window, she watched him walk up the high street towards the hill, unhurried, and it was a long moment before she realized she was smiling at absolutely nothing, alone in her shop like a perfect fool. Don't you dare, she told herself out loud in the voice she had once used on weeping novelists. Don't you dare. The shop, being a shop, offered no opinion. But the last of the sun came through the gilt letters on the window and scattered gold all down the poetry section, and it looked, if not like an opinion, then very like an omen. Chapter 3. Third pew, pulpit side. St. Mary's, Nether Wyckham, smelled of beeswax chrysanthemums and 900 years of prayer. Clara arrived 4 minutes before 10 on Sunday, which turned out to be a rank amateur's error. The entire congregation was already seated, and the walk down the aisle to Beatrice's pew, third from the front, pulpit side, was conducted under the frank and friendly observation of some 60 pairs of eyes. Peggy Pruitt, resplendent in a hat with a feather, gave her a nod of magisterial approval. Mrs. Chandra from the post office smiled and shifted her hymn book in welcome. Somewhere near the back, a baby was already grizzling its opinion of the whole enterprise. Adam Brier sat across the aisle and 1 row back, in what she would come to know as the churchwarden's pew. Beside the wand of office, he never once in his life consented to carry in procession. He was scrubbed and combed and wearing a tweed jacket that had been good 20 years ago, and he looked precisely as comfortable as a hill ram at a cattle show. When Clara sat, the old pew creaked a welcome, and she found her aunt's Neela, embroidered of course with a lantern, and her aunt's name penciled inside the hymn book cover in copperplate, and had to spend a moment looking very hard at the stained glass until her eyes behaved. The Reverend Thomas Milton was younger than she'd expected, earnest and slightly rumpled, with the air of a man perpetually 3 minutes behind his own sermon. But when he read the gospel, his voice settled and steadied. And when he preached, on the lilies of the field, consider them, how they grow, he said one thing that lodged in Clara like a burr in wool. We think worry is a form of responsibility, he said. We're rather proud of it in England, but our Lord calls it what it is, a failure of memory. Consider the lilies. Remember what you have already been given, and by whom, and then look at tomorrow again and see if it doesn't stand differently in the light. To my great-niece Clara, who has forgotten what she loves, I leave the means of remembering. Clara sat very still in the third pew, pulpit side, while the words found their mark. She did not go to the communion rail. She was not ready, could not have said exactly for what, only that walking up there felt like signing her name to something while her heart was still disputing the terms. But when the congregation sang the last hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, which Beatrice had specifically forbidden at her funeral on the grounds that it made everyone soggy, and which the village had sung anyway, sogginess and all, Clara sang it. Her voice cracked on Morning by Morning, New Mercies I See, and from across the aisle, 1 row back, a low baritone came in under the congregation like a dry stone wall under a hedge. Not showy, not even particularly tuneful. Just there, holding the line so that her wavering treble had something to lean against. She did not look round. He did not look over. But she leaned, and the wall held, and that was the second small mercy of Nether Wyckham. Afterwards there was coffee in the church hall, and Clara was passed from parishioner to parishioner like a parcel at a party, condoled with, welcomed, invited, assessed, and fed 2 pieces of shortbread against her express wishes. Reverend Milton pumped her hand and said Beatrice had been the backbone of the parish book club, and would she consider, and Peggy materialised to say she had already considered. Thomas, do keep up, and the harvest supper readings were settled. It was there, over lukewarm coffee in a green cup, that Clara heard the name Halloran again. 3rd time they've been up to see the parish council, a stout man in a British Legion tie was saying, talking about community benefit now. New village hall they're offering if the scheme goes through. AstroTurf pitch. As if we're to be bought with AstroTurf. Some'll be tempted, Frank, said Mrs. Chandra quietly. The Wilsons' boy can't get a house within 20 miles, and he's not the only one. It's easy to be against new houses when you've got one. An awkward, honest silence followed, the sound of a village looking at both sides of its own coin. Clara filed it away. Whatever Halloran and Vane were, they were not stupid, and they were not going to fight fair. They're not offering houses the Wilsons' boy could buy, Asha, and well, you know it. Adam had come up on the edge of the circle with a cup he plainly had no intention of drinking. 4 and 5 bedrooms, double garages. They'd price out the family and pave the water meadow to do it. That meadow's taken the flood off this village since Domesday. Build on it, and you'd best teach the post office to swim. There he is, said Frank comfortably. Sunday sermon number 2. Well, Adam set the cup down untasted. Some of us only get wound up once a week. But he said it mildly, and the circle laughed, and Clara understood that this was an old dance with well-worn steps, and that the village loved him the way you loved the hill itself. Something permanent, occasionally in the way, and unthinkable to be without. He fell in beside her, unhurried, as she walked back down the hill after. The morning had come up bright and cold, the beeches along the churchyard wall burning copper, and the wild chattering under the bridge as if butter wouldn't melt. You didn't go up, he said. Not a question, not an accusation either. Just the observation of a man who noticed things. No, Clara said. And then, because there was something about him that made prevarication feel like bad manners. I've been in a disagreement with God since the spring. It seemed dishonest to go up to the rail as if we were on speaking terms. Adam walked a few paces in silence, hands behind his back, considering this the way he'd consider a fence line. I didn't take communion for a year, he said at last. After Emily. Milton never said a word. Beatrice said plenty. She generally did. But the one that stuck, she gave me out of Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He glanced sideways at her. I told her that was easy for Job to say. She said, Adam, you great fool. It took Job 42 chapters to say it, and he shouted for 40 of them. Shout. The Almighty's heard worse, and he'd rather have your shouting than your silence. Clara laughed, startled, a real laugh, up from underneath everything. That is exactly what she was like. She once told my mother that worrying was prayer with the address written wrong. She had a whole doctrine of the post. They had reached the shop. The carriage lamp was still burning from the night before, pale in the sunshine, and Adam looked up at it for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. You've kept it lit. Every night, it seemed, she hunted for the word. Load-bearing. It is. He settled his cap. The whole street's the better for it. Right. I've used to see to. He was 3 steps gone when he turned, as though remembering something left on a list. "The harvest supper. Peggy'll have told you I don't come." She mentioned it, yes. "I'm telling you I might," Adam Brier said, to the middle distance somewhere over her left shoulder. And then he walked up the hill towards Hartsfoot with the deliberate unconcern of a man who has just surprised himself and would prefer not to discuss it, while Clara stood under her great-aunt's lamp with her heart doing something entirely unauthorized. "Don't," she told it again. It didn't listen. Hearts, in her experience, were the worst listeners in creation, except possibly for sheep. That evening she climbed to the flat above the shop, made toast she didn't eat, and finally did the thing she'd been circling for 2 days. She opened the bottom drawer of Beatrice's writing desk, where the solicitor had said personal papers were kept, and found the letters. Her own letters, first. Everyone she'd ever written her great-aunt, from crayoned 6-year-old thank yous to the thin, glossy Christmas cards of her London years, each one dated and kept. It was the dwindling that shamed her. Pages, then paragraphs, then printed cards with 2 lines of biro. Mustache, all well. Love, C. Beatrice had kept even those. And beneath them, a bundle in unfamiliar ink, tied with garden twine. The top one was dated 4 years ago. "Dear Miss Whitcombe," it began. "You will think it strange to receive a letter from a man you see every Sunday, but there are things a person can write that he cannot say with his cap in his hands. You ask me, after Emily, how I keep going up the hill each morning. I have thought about it all week, and the truthful answer is, the sheep don't know she's gone. They need feeding regardless. I used to resent that. I have started lately to suspect it is a kindness, that the Lord, in his mercy, hides the next step inside the day's work, so a man never has to take more than one of them at a time." Clara read it to the end. Then she sat for a long time with Adam Brier's grief in her lap, in her dead aunt's chair, in the lamplight, feeling like a trespasser and unable to stop, and understanding at last what Beatrice had been to him, the one person he could shout to, 40 chapters worth, while the village saw only the dry stone wall. She tied the twine back exactly as she'd found it. She put the letters away. And that night, for the first time since the spring, Clara Whitcombe knelt down by her bed like a child, furious, grieving, embarrassed, hopeful, and shouted at God in a whisper for the better part of an hour. The Almighty, as advertised, had heard worse. And morning came, and the mercies, as advertised, were new. Chapter 4. Ledger and Lamplight. October ripened. The beeches went from copper to flame, the clocks went back, and Clara learned the shape of her new life the way you learn a stair in the dark, by barking her shins on it. She learned that the shop's regulars arrived by liturgical calendar. Mrs. Chandra on Mondays for the crossword books, Frank of the British Legion tie on Wednesdays for military history he'd already read, the vicar on Fridays, just to browse, which meant an hour in the theology section and an apologetic purchase of 1 greeting card. She learned that half the village had an account, a system of Beatrice's invention that appeared to be equal parts credit, barter, and pastoral care, and which explained a good deal about the green ledger. Old Mr. Tetlow's account had been settled for 11 years in walking sticks and kindling. The Wilsons had simply been quietly zeroed each January in red ink with a note. Paid in full. See Matthew 6:12. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Beatrice had run the shop on the Lord's Prayer, and it was, by any accounting standard Clara had ever learned, a catastrophe. It was also, she was coming to see, the reason 60 people had wept at an old woman's funeral, and the reason the lamp mattered, and possibly the most solvent thing in the village. The actual figures, however, remained the actual figures. And so, on the last Tuesday of October, when Adam appeared at closing time with a crate of eggs, a brace of pheasants she had no idea what to do with, and the diffident announcement that he'd done the farm's books 20 year and could look over hers if she liked, no bother if not, Clara locked the door, turned the sign, and got out the green ledger before he could change his mind. They worked at the counter by lamplight, the shop shut and glowing around them like the inside of a chestnut. Adam turned out to be exactly what she'd expected with numbers: slow, thorough, and impossible to hurry. Running his finger down the columns, making small pencil notes in a hand she now knew very well indeed, from a bundle tied in garden twine. She made tea. The rain came on against the bow window, companionable now that it was on the other side of the glass. "Your aunt," Adam said at last, sitting back, "was subsidizing this village to the tune of about £2,000 a year and had been since before you were born." "I know." "The loan's the trouble. The shop trades near enough even, once you stop." He tapped the red ink forgivenesses gently as a man touches a war memorial. "Once you account for her charitable works. But the loan repayments want £400 a month you haven't got, and the roof wants £3,000 by spring you also haven't got." He laid the pencil down. "And Halloran's offer would clear all of it and leave you enough to open 3 shops somewhere else. I'd be lying if I said otherwise, and you'd find it out anyway. You should know the whole of it before you decide anything." "I've decided." "You decided in the first week when your blood was up." He said it without heat, watching her. "Decide again in November, with the ledger open. It'll be a better-made decision, and it'll hold in a gale." It was, Clara thought, the least romantic thing a man had ever said to her, and she was horrified to notice it landed somewhere south of her sternum, with more force than any of James's set-piece declarations ever had. James had proposed on a rooftop in the Shard, with a photographer he'd hired lurking behind a pillar. Adam Brier was telling her to re-decide against him in November for her own sake, and blushing faintly at the top of his ears while he did it. "Then help me make the numbers argue back," she said. "You know this village. What would Beatrice do if she'd had a partner with sense?" He thought about it properly, the way he thought about everything, while the rain worked the window. "Post office is bursting," he said slowly. "Asha Chandra's been wanting to put a coffee machine in for 2 years and hasn't the floor space. Your back room's full of boxes and dead stock." He turned the ledger round, sketched the shop's floor plan in 6 pencil strokes, and drew a doorway that did not exist. "Books and coffee. Split the takings on the machine, and her passing trade becomes yours. The Ramblers already think you're a cafe. Stop disappointing them. Then there's the church book club, 30 strong and homeless since the hall roof went, the school with no library since the cuts, and every farm wife in 10 miles who'd kill for 1 evening a month that isn't about anybody's tea." He pushed the ledger back. "Beatrice ran a shop that gave everything away. You could run one where the village has somewhere to be, and pays for the privilege in coffee and paperbacks without ever noticing. It's the same commandment. Better plumbing." Clara stared at the 6 pencil strokes. "The same commandment?" "Love thy neighbour." The ears again, faintly. "It doesn't say at a loss." She laughed, and he smiled that long-travelling smile, and then, reaching both at once for the pencil, her to write, him to make some further note, their hands met on the counter. It was nothing. It was 3 seconds. His hand was warm and rough as oak bark, and entirely covered hers, and neither of them moved, and the rain went on, and the lamp hissed softly, and Clara heard her own heartbeat with a clarity she associated with diving boards. She looked up. He was already looking at her, and for one unguarded instant, everything in his weathered, careful face was legible. The loneliness, the wanting, the fear of the wanting. Before the shutters came down and he withdrew his hand with the deliberate slowness of a man declining to snatch, which was somehow more devastating than snatching would have been. "Right," he said, to the ledger. His voice had gravel in it. "The pheasants want hanging 3 days. Peggy will tell you how." "Adam, it's late," He was up, cap in hand, all dry stone wall again. You've a fine plan there. Talk to Asher. At the door, he stopped, one hand on the latch, his back to her, and she watched him have some short, violent argument with himself and lose it, or win it, she couldn't tell which. The harvest supper, he said to the door. You'll be reading. I will. Then I'll come, he said, and went out into the rain without a coat. Having left it, she discovered a full minute later over the back of his chair. And Clara Whitcombe stood alone in her lamplit shop, holding a waxed jacket that smelled of hay and rain and sheep and him, thinking with great clarity and no conviction whatsoever, oh no. She talked to Asher. Asher, it transpired, had been waiting 2 years for exactly this conversation, produced a folder of coffee machine brochures from under the post office counter like a conjurer, and negotiated a taking split with a ruthlessness that would have earned a standing ovation on Clara's old acquisitions floor. Davy Fox came to price the doorway between the two premises and stayed to buy a book about motorcycles. The church book club, informed by Peggy that it had a new home, responded by turning up 8 days early, en masse, with its own biscuits. And on the Friday, the vicar came for his hour in the theology section and left without buying a card, because instead he sat down at the counter, polished his glasses, and said, I understand Halloran and Vane have written to you. 3 times, I haven't answered. No. Well. Thomas Milton held his glasses up to the light, frowned, and polished them again. A delaying tactic, she was beginning to learn, of a gentle man about to say a hard thing. They've now written to the diocese about the glebe field, the church land along the river, between your terrace and Adam's bottom field. It seems their access road could go through Glebe as easily as through Hartsfoot. And the diocese, Clara, is not a village. The diocese has a deficit and a formula, and the formula does not have a line in it for water meadows or for lamps kept lit. He put the glasses on and looked at her through them, mild and unhappy. I've been asked to sound out parish opinion, which means it's begun. I thought you should hear it from the pulpit side, as it were, before you hear it sideways. That's the second time a man said that to me in this shop. Yes, said the vicar. We're a sideways sort of place. It's our great weakness and our great strength, and the harvest supper is a week tomorrow, and I would ask you. He stood, and suddenly looked less woolly than she had ever seen him. To read something with a spine in it, Miss Whitcombe. This village is about to have to decide what it is. Beatrice always knew what it was. Her pew ought to say so. The bell rang him out. Clara sat a long while as the light went down the high street, and then she climbed to the flat and took down her aunt's Bible, the big one, the King James, with 50 years of pencil in the margins, and began to hunt for a reading with a spine in it. She found the page dog-eared, as though it had been waiting. Ruth, Chapter 1. In the margin, in copperplate, decades old, Beatrice had written a single line. The whole gospel is here. Love that stays put. Chapter 5. The Harvest Supper. The church hall of St. Mary's, Nether Wyckham, had been decorated for harvest by a committee under Peggy Pruitt's command, and it showed. Sheaves of wheat stood sentry at the door. Marrows of frankly intimidating size lined the stage like artillery. Every trestle table wore gingham, every windowsill its pyramid of apples, and the whole room smelled of pastry, paraffin heaters, and chrysanthemums. The smell, Clara would ever after think, of belonging. She had spent the afternoon in a state she refused to name. It was not about the reading. She had read aloud to rooms full of hostile publishers. It was not about the supper. It was about a man who had said, then, I'll come to a door, and whose wax jacket had hung on the back of her chair for 9 days, because neither of them had found a way to raise the subject of its return that didn't sound like something else. He came. He came scrubbed and combed in the 20-year-old tweed, carrying a crate of Hartsfoot apples for the auction, and the hall did not fall silent. Nether Wyckham had better manners than that. But a ripple went through it, a current of glances and nudges, 3 years deep. Peggy Pruitt, without missing a syllable of her instructions to the tea-urn detail, reached out as he passed and squeezed his forearm once. He put his apples with the marrows. He sat at the end of a bench next to Frank, who dealt him into the conversation as though he'd never been away. And when the pie was eaten and the auction fought, the largest marrow went for £11 and a promise of dry logs, after a bidding war that would live in legend. The vicar stood, and the hall hushed, and Clara walked up to the little stage with her great-aunt's Bible in her hands. "My aunt did this reading for 50 years, she said. "I found the page dog-eared, so I think she chose it for us before she went. It's from the Book of Ruth. Naomi has lost everything, her husband, her sons, her place in the world. She's going home to Bethlehem with nothing, and she tells her widowed daughters-in-law to leave her, go back, save themselves, be sensible. And one of them is sensible." Clara looked out at the hall, at Asher and her husband, at Frank, at Peggy, at the Wilsons crammed in with their grown son, at Adam Brier sitting very still at the end of his bench. And she found that her voice was steady and had a spine in it after all. And one of them is Ruth. She read. "And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." The hall was silent. Somewhere a paraffin heater ticked. "My aunt wrote one line in the margin," Clara said. She wrote, "The whole gospel is here, love that stays put." She closed the Bible. "I've been the sensible daughter-in-law most of my life. I went where the prospects were. There's no shame in it. Scripture doesn't scold her, but it doesn't follow her either. The story goes with the one who stays, who binds herself to a broken old woman and a played-out farm town with no plan except love and gleaning." She took a breath. "Some men in suits think this village is a site with sentimental complications. I've read their letters. I want to say, in front of witnesses, since that's how it was done in Ruth's day too, the lantern isn't for sale. Whither this village goes, I will go. You're stuck with me. Amen." What happened next was not applause, exactly, or not only. It was Frank on his feet, and then the Wilsons, and Peggy hammering a tea-urn with a ladle, and the whole hall up and roaring in the way of people who have been holding a fearful question in their chests for months and have just heard someone answer it out loud. Clara stood on the stage with her heart going like the Wyle in flood and looked in all that uproar for one face, and found it. Adam had not stood. Adam was sitting perfectly still at the end of his bench, looking at her the way men in old paintings look at annunciations, as though something had entered the room that changed all subsequent arithmetic. Then Peggy declared the dancing, and the tables were shoved back, and Nether Wyckham fell upon Strip the Willow with the reckless abandon of a village that only dances twice a year and means to make it count. He found her at the tea-urn an hour later when she'd been spun breathless by Frank, the vicar, both Chandras, and an 8-year-old Wilson with a promising future in demolition. "That was Beatrice's Bible," Adam said. "It was. She'd have..." He stopped, started again. "There's 50 years of this village heard that lesson read from that stage, and I've heard it everyone since I could walk, and I never once..." He gave it up and looked at her, and the shutters were not down, and the hall's cheerful din receded to a distant weather. "You read it, like it cost you something. That's the only way it's true." "It cost me something," Clara said. I know." And then, with the air of a man stepping off a high place, Will you dance? You dance? No, said Adam Brier. Not in 3 years, and badly before that. But it's the dashing white sergeant next, and even a ram can walk in a circle. He danced like a man laying a hedge, deliberate, exact, entirely without flair, and impossible to knock over. And Clara laughed until her ribs ached, and the village watched them go round with the benevolent shamelessness of 60 chaperones, and when the music threw them together for the turn, his hand at her waist was as careful as if she were made of church glass, and as warm as if she were not. They turned. The hall blurred, gingham, lamplight, marrows, faces, and steadied on the one fixed point of his eyes, grey-green, unshuttered, at a distance of 10 inches, and Clara understood with total finality that she was not falling in love with Adam Brier at some safely future date. It was done. It had been done, probably, since the note waited with a riverstone. The music ended. He stepped back the full and proper distance and bowed his head an inch, farm formal, and said, "Thank you," in a voice with the gravel in it again. And the whole crowded hall stood between them like a mercy, because if it had not, she knew it, and she watched him know it. One of them would have done something that could not be undone at a harvest supper in front of the vicar. Not yet, said something in her that was wiser than she was, and sounded a good deal like Beatrice. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, that ye stir not up, nor awake my love, till he please. Song of Solomon. Beatrice had penciled beside it, that is, don't force the rhubarb. Clara went home at 11 with her coat on her shoulders and her heart entirely off its lead, and found, on the step of the lantern, under the burning lamp, a jar of hartsfoot honey with a label in a strong upright hand. For the reading. A bee. She was still smiling at it when she saw the other thing. A business card, wedged into the door jamb at eye height where it could not be missed. Heavy cream stock, grey lettering. Halloran and Vane, Land and Development. James Ashworth, Director Acquisitions. And on the back, in a hand she knew as well as her own, in ink that turned her warm, bright evening to a thin, cold film. Surprise Claire, in the village till Friday, staying at the wheat sheaf. We should talk. I think you'll find we want the same thing, as usual. JX. Clara stood under the lamp for a long time. The honey was cold in her hand. Up the dark hill, one light burned at Hartsfoot, steady as a fixed star, and down in the village the last of the harvest supper laughter died away down the lanes, and between the two stood Clara Whitcombe, holding sweetness in one hand and the past in the other. No, she said at last, to the card, to the X, to the whole reasonable, praying, acquiring shape of him arriving here now, into this. Oh, no, you don't. But her hands, she noticed, had begun to shake. Some debts of fear, it seemed, took longer to forgive than others, even with the address written right. Chapter 6. The Man from Acquisitions. James Ashworth came into the lantern at 10 the next morning, which was exactly like him. Early enough to seem eager, late enough to be sure she'd be open, and timed to the minute of the shop's one quiet hour, when Asha was busy with pensions and the Ramblers hadn't yet mistaken anyone for a cafe. He looked, Clara had to concede, superb. He always had. Cashmere overcoat in a grey that matched the letterhead, that expensive haircut that pretended not to be one, and the smile, warm, rueful, calibrated, that had closed 100 deals and 1 engagement. He stood in the middle of her shop, the way Adam had stood in it that first day, and the difference was total. Adam had looked at the shelves the way men look at a church. James looked at them the way men look at a sight. Claire, soft, wondering, as if the sight of her were weather he hadn't dressed for. You look. This place suits you. I mean that. Hello, James. She stayed behind the counter and was glad of the counter, 3 feet of Victorian oak between her and 18 months of her life. Director of Acquisitions, congratulations. Was that the job in Zurich? Or did wanting my aunt's shop come first and the title after? That's not, he did the laugh, the one that conceded a point to disarm the next 3. All right, I deserve that. I deserve most of what you're going to say, and I'd like you to say it, actually, all of it, because I've had a year to think and you've had a year to be angry, and both of those are honest work. He came to the counter and set down, not a folder, but a paper bag from the bakery in Chipping Campden. Almond croissants. You used to say they were proof of a benevolent creator. I used to say a lot of things. Some of them at an altar rehearsal. He took it. She watched him take it, the small flinch professionally metabolized, and hated that she knew his machinery this well, and hated more the small traitor part of her that was gratified by the flinch. That's not forgiveness, said the Beatrice voice. That's just anger with better posture. You'll want to see to that. Why are you here, James? Officially, because my firm has made 3 generous offers to this property and received no reply, and I told the board the personal connection might help. He held her eyes. That had always been his tell, the extra second of eye contact when the truth got selective. Unofficially, Clara, when your aunt's name came up on the file, I asked for it. I asked for this file, because it meant a reason to drive out here and stand in front of you and say that ending it the way I did was the worst thing I've ever done, and God has not let me put it down. His voice did the drop, the catch, the one that had wept. Genuinely, she'd believed at the time, at his grandfather's funeral. I've prayed about this. Don't. It came out flat as slate. You may say anything you like to me, James, but you will not pray at me, not again. You prayed at me the day you left. You made the Almighty a co-signatory on your exit. It took me a year and a dead aunt and a village full of strangers to be able to say the word Lord without flinching, and I will not have you in this shop handling that word like it's leverage. The shop rang with it. James stood very still, and for a moment, one real moment she'd wonder about it for weeks, something looked out of his face that was neither charm nor machinery, something young and lost and almost honest. Then the professional came back, smooth as a tide over sand. That's fair, he said quietly. That's fair, and I'll earn better. Look, the offer's in here. The folder now laid gently on the counter, squared to the oak's edge. It's gone up again. It clears the loan, the roof, everything in that green ledger. Yes, I know about the green ledger, Claire. It's my job. And there's a relocation package, a better shop, a bigger one, Cirencester, Stowe, wherever you like. You'd keep the name. The lantern, but with footfall. She'd have wanted the bookstore survive, not the drains. He stepped back from the folder, hands open, the closer's crucifix pose. I'm at the wheat sheaf till Friday. Have dinner with me, just dinner, and tell me about her. I only met her the once, at the smallest hesitation, at the engagement do. She told me I had a good head and asked to see the rest of me. I've thought about that a lot this year. And that was the arrow that got through because it was true. And it was exactly what Beatrice would have said, and grief has no security to speak of. Clara's eyes stung, and James saw it, because seeing it was his job, and he had the grace or the cunning to leave on it, bell ringing, croissants on the counter, folder squared to the edge, the smell of his cologne hanging in her aunt's shop like a question. She gave the croissants to the Ramblers at 11. She put the folder in the drawer under the paper clips, on top of its 3 brothers. And she got through the day. The book club came, and the man about the coffee machine, and Davy Fox with a quote for the doorway. And it was fine. It was all fine, right up until 4:30, when the bell rang and Adam Brier came in with the mended shop ladder over one shoulder and stopped dead 2 steps inside the door. She saw him take it in. The cologne, first. She watched it reach him, watched him identify it as money and stranger. then the wheat sheaf's cream and grey folder corner, which she had not quite got into the drawer because the drawer was full of its brothers. Then her face, which had been crying at some point in the early afternoon, briefly, in the stockroom, about her aunt and altars and almond croissants, and thought it had tidied itself since. "There was a man at the wheat sheaf last night," Adam said, without inflection. "London, asking after the shop and the glebe and my bottom field, asking after you by your first name." He set the ladder down against the poetry shelves with enormous care, the way a man is careful when carelessness is very near. Frank heard him on the phone in the snug. The personal connection. That's what he called you, to his board. Adam. Ashworth. He said the name like a weight he was testing. "The one you were to marry. He's here for the site, and he's using—" And there Adam Brier, churchwarden, stopped himself, jaw tight, and rebuilt the sentence stone by stone. "It's not my business what he's here for, or what he was to you. It's your shop, and your past, and I've no claim to an opinion on either." His voice was level and terrible. "But I sat in that hall last night and heard you bind yourself to this village out of the Book of Ruth, and it was the finest thing I've heard in that hall in my life, and I'll not stand by and watch a man in a cashmere coat turn it into a negotiating position. Whatever you decide it. Don't let him pray it out of you." "You think I don't know what he is?" Her own voice was shaking now. "I found out what he was in front of 200 cancelled invitations, Adam. I don't need the parish grapevine to brief me on James Ashworth, and I have not the slightest intention of—" She stopped because she'd heard it, the thing under his level and terrible voice, the thing he'd hidden even from himself under the fine speech about villages and negotiating positions. He was not angry the way a churchwarden is angry. He was afraid the way a man is afraid. "He was in this shop today," she said more quietly. "For 11 minutes. He left an offer I haven't read and croissants I gave to hikers. I cried this afternoon once about my aunt. That's the whole of it, the whole account, and you're the only man in England I'd let audit it." The clock ticked. The lamp, unlit yet, waited in the window. "I'd no right to ask," Adam said at last, low. "You didn't ask. That was the trouble. You concluded." She came round the counter, 3 feet of Victorian oak, and then nothing at all between them but 18 inches of shop air and every unsaid thing since a rainy lane in October. "Ask. Next time." He looked down at her. The grey-green eyes went over her face slowly, shelf by shelf, like a man checking his stock after a storm and finding, against expectation, nothing lost. "Aye," he said. The gravel was back. "Next time." And he took up his cap and went, because it was that, or the other thing, and they both knew it, and the bell rang, and Clara stood in the middle of her shop breathing like she'd carried the ladder herself. She lit the lamp early that night. "Up the hill," Hartsfoot answered, steady as a fixed star. And at the wheat sheaf, in the window of the best room, a third light burned late, patient, well-funded, and squared to the edge of the table. Chapter 7. The Storm at Hartsfoot. The storm had a name. The Met Office had taken to naming them, like hurricanes, like children. But in Nether Wyckham, it would only ever be called the November Gale, and it arrived on the Thursday with 3 days' warning and no mercy whatsoever. Clara went up to Hartsfoot that afternoon for the most unromantic reason imaginable: the parish magazine. She had rashly agreed to take over Beatrice's column, Notes from the Lantern, established 1974. The deadline was Friday. The vicar wanted a paragraph from the churchwarden about the state of the Hall Roof Fund, and the churchwarden did not answer his telephone, had never answered his telephone, and was widely suspected of keeping it in a drawer. So she walked up the hill in the strange yellow stormlight with a notebook in her pocket, telling herself it was parish business, and the sky over the wolds piled up behind her like a judgment. Hartsfoot Farm sat in the shoulder of the hill as though it had grown there. A long, low house of the golden stone, a fold of barns, a yard swept cleaner than most kitchens. She found Adam in the big barn, amid a sea of hurdles and straw, and the parish magazine died on her lips, because the barn was full of ewes, and the ewes were full of lambs, and one of them was in trouble. "You've come at a bad time or a good one," Adam said, without looking up. He was kneeling in the straw, jacket off, sleeves rolled, his forearms bare, and his voice gone quiet and steady in a way she'd never heard. The voice she understood at once that everything on this farm trusted. "Early lambs, my own fault. I put the tup in early for the spring market, and now the weather's coming, and this shearling's got a big single stuck and no notion what to do about it. Have you, lass? Can you follow instruction and not faint?" "I read Ruth in front of the whole village," Clara said, taking off her coat. Gleaning was implied. What followed was the strangest, muddiest, most sacramental hour of her life. She knelt in the straw where he told her, held what he told her, steadied the ewe's head against her chest, and talked nonsense into its ear, while Adam worked with a patience that was somehow ferocious, quiet, absolute, his whole strength turned down to the fineness of a watchmaker's. Rain arrived on the roof like applause, and then there was a slither and a rush and a yellow, bawling, impossible scrap of life in the straw, and Adam cleared its mouth and swung it gently by the forelegs and set it at its mother's head, and the ewe, who 30 seconds ago had been trying to die, turned herself inside out with love. "There," Adam said softly, to the ewe, to the lamb, to the barn, perhaps to God. "There now. That's the whole of it." Clara discovered she was crying and laughing at once, wet to the elbows, straw in her hair, and that she had never in her life felt more like herself. Adam looked across the ewe at her, and what was in his face then was past all shutters, plain as print. "You, here, in my barn, with straw in your hair, weeping over a lamb. Of course it's you." "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd," Clara said unsteadily. "He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom. I've sung it every Christmas of my life. Handel, I never once thought about the mess." "Aye, well," Adam sat back on his heels, and the smile came the whole long way. "That's Christmas and all. Folk forget where he was born. It wasn't a bookshop." And that was when the November gale hit the hill. It came like a shoulder against the barn door, one enormous buffet, and then the sustained roar of a wind that meant it, and rain going horizontal against the north wall, and somewhere in the yard something metal went over with a clang. Adam was up at once, out into it, and back in 2 minutes, streaming like a man pulled from the wile. That's the power off down the valley. Village is dark, and the beck's over the lane already at the bottom of the track. He looked at her, and she watched him arrive at the arithmetic, and dislike it, and be helpless before it. "You'll not get down tonight, Clara. Not on foot, not in the Land Rover, not till it drops. The ford will be 4 foot of moving water, and I've buried a neighbour who thought otherwise." "The lamp," Clara said, absurdly. "I haven't lit the lamp." "The lamp'll forgive you. The beck won't." He raked the wet hair off his forehead, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely at a loss. A man who could deliver a stuck lamb in a gale, utterly wrecked on the rocks of propriety. There's the house, and it's warm, and there's food, and..." He squared himself as before the reversing van. "You'll have my room. It has the lock. I'll be in the barn the night anyway with these ewes. It's where I'd be regardless. It's lambing." "Adam." "And Peggy Pruitt will have it round 3 parishes by Sunday regardless of the facts, so the facts had best be granite." "Adam." He stopped. "Thank you," Clara said. "Yes, and for the record, I trust you further than the facts require." "Aye," he said low. "That's the trouble." The farmhouse kitchen was stone-flagged and lamplit, warmed by an ancient range, and it broke her heart in a way she was careful not to show, because it was a museum. Emily was everywhere and nowhere, in the choice of the blue jugs on the dresser, the pencil marks on a door frame that stopped abruptly, a niece's heights, Clara guessed, or godchildren, the framed cross-stitch by the window. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The herb bed, visible through the rain-lashed glass, gone 3 years to seed. A house kept perfectly, and perfectly still. A held breath in golden stone. They ate at the kitchen table, eggs, fried bread, the hartsfoot honey, tea the colour of the beck, with the gale hammering the north wall and the lamp between them, and it should have been awkward, and was instead the easiest hour of her life. He came in from checking the ewes at 9 and at 10, and between rounds they talked. About Beatrice, about the shop plan, about his father, about her mother, about the vicar's chances with the Hall Roof Fund, about nothing, about everything except the 2 subjects seated at the table with them, one wearing cashmere and one wearing a wedding ring in a drawer somewhere upstairs. It was at the door, at the end, when he'd banked the range and set the candle and matches by her hand, because the power was off, and shown her the stair, and was going out to the barn with his bedroll like the last gentleman in Gloucestershire, that the night nearly went otherwise. She never afterwards knew how it happened. He turned to say good-night in the narrow stone hall at the same moment she turned to say it, and the hall was old and built for smaller centuries, and suddenly there was no shop counter, no crowded church hall, no proper distance. There was candlelight, and the gale shouldering the house, and Adam Brier close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat, and the exact place where the grey of his eyes went green. His hand had come up, somewhere in the turning, and rested at her jaw as though it had grown there, rough and warm and infinitely careful, his thumb at her cheekbone. She heard his breath go out of him, ragged, like a man setting down a weight. Clara. Her name in his mouth was a whole letter, tied in twine. "I know," she whispered. "If I stay in this hall 1 more minute," Adam said, with the terrible honesty of a man narrating his own weather, "I'm going to kiss you, and I'll not do it like this, with you storm-bound under my roof with nowhere to go, and half of me still learning how to be alive, and a man at the wheat sheaf you've not finished being angry at, and no word said in daylight between us. You deserve daylight, Clara Whitcombe. You deserve the whole order of service." His thumb moved once across her cheekbone, the single unbudgeted expense of a careful man. And then his hand was gone, and the cold air where it had been was the loudest thing in the house. "Stir not up, nor awake love, till it please," he said hoarsely, backing into the storm's doorway. "Beatrice used to quote it at me when I'd rush a job. It pleases, Clara. God knows it pleases. But I'll do it in daylight, or not at all." "Adam Brier," Clara said, when she could speak. "You are the only man in England who could turn me down and have it be the most romantic thing that has ever happened to me." "Aye, well." The smile, and the ears, and the rain roaring behind him. "Lock the door, not against me, against Peggy's imagination. Good night, Clara." "Good night, Adam." She locked the door. She lay in his stark, clean room under a quilt that smelled of cedar, with the gale walking the roof and the candle guttering on a bare nightstand. Bare except for a Bible and a photograph, face down, that she did not touch. And she stared into the dark, burning quietly and gloriously and entirely without shame, and thought, so that's what it is. That's what it's meant to be like. Not a rooftop and a hired photographer. A man who walks out into a November gale to keep your honor and his own, quoting the Song of Solomon. At 2, she heard him cross the yard between barn checks, and pause. She was sure of it. She would have staked the shop on it, beneath her window, in the rain, for the space of 3 heartbeats, before going on. At 3, the gale began to drop. At 6, she woke to grey light, silence, and the sound of a man singing very low and badly to newborn lambs in a barn. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Clara lay still and listened, and let the tears run sideways into a pillow that smelled of cedar, and gave up the last of her year-long quarrel without terms. All right, she prayed. All right, you win. Thy people shall be my people. And if it's not too much trouble, that one, down there, singing flat to the sheep. Please. Amen. Chapter 8. Whispers and Water. Adam drove her down at 8, once the beck had dropped, in a Land Rover that smelled of dog and diesel, past a valley strewn with the gale's litter, slates in gardens, a willow down across the cricket field, the while brown and muscular and a foot below the top of its banks. He said very little. She said less. The 18 inches of gear stick between them was the most crowded space in Gloucestershire. The village, powerless overnight, had of course had nothing to do but talk. Clara walked into the post office at 9 for the parish magazine proofs, and the conversation stopped with the beautiful precision of an orchestra hitting a rest. Asha Chandra's face was a masterpiece of neutrality. 2 of the flower committee examined the greetings cards with their backs to the room, and Peggy Pruitt, who did not believe in rests, said, "Well, and how are things up the hill, dear?" "Loud," Clara said. "The gale hit the barn about 6. We delivered a stuck lamb. Mr. Brier spent the night in the straw with his ewes, and I spent it behind a locked door in a borrowed room, praying for the roof. I had fried eggs at 6:30, and I've straw in my boots yet. Was there anything else, or shall I put it in my column?" There was a silence, and then Peggy Pruitt laughed, a great, unladylike, delighted honk, and the room breathed out with her. "Beatrice's chin," she announced to the post office at large, "and Beatrice's tongue. No, dear, that'll do nicely. Though I'll say this much." And she leaned in, dropping to the whisper that carried further than her shout. 3 years we've prayed that man down off that hill, and it took one bookshop to do it. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he works in removals vans. She patted Clara's hand. The lock was a nice touch. Tell him the flower committee said so. So that was the village dealt with. Or so Clara thought, walking back down the high street with the proofs, buoyant despite the grey morning. She was wrong, and the wrongness was waiting at the shop door, wearing cashmere. "You didn't come home last night," James said. He said it lightly, hands in pockets, a man remarking on weather, but his eyes did the extra second. "I came by at 7 with the revised terms. Shop dark, lamp out. First night the lamp's been out since you got here, they tell me at the pub. They tell you everything at that pub." He smiled the rueful smile. "The farmer, is it? The churchwarden with the sheep and the dead wife. Claire. Really." And Clara, who had faced down the flower committee without a tremor, felt the old machinery close around her like a familiar coat. The light tone with the hook in it, the intimacy assumed, the Claire, the way he reached past your life and flicked precisely the one wound. A year ago it would have worked. A year ago she'd have explained herself, at length, apologetically, on her own doorstep. "James," she said, "you have a gift. You've just called the best man I know a line item, insulted a dead woman, and surveilled my lamp, in under a minute, while smiling. The board's getting a bargain." She unlocked her door. "The shop's not for sale. The answer to the letter you left, and the one before it, and the one you're about to leave, is no. Put it in the file. Personal connection exhausted." The smile went. What replaced it was the thing she'd only seen twice in 18 months. Once at a deal that died, once at the altar rehearsal when his mother asked a question he didn't like. The flat, swift accounting of a man moving an asset to the loss column. "You should know the scheme goes through regardless," he said, and the warmth was gone from his voice like power from a valley. The diocese is minded to sell the glebe. We've a highways consultant who thinks we can thread the access without your terrace or Brier's field. It's tighter, it's dearer, but it prices. Your no doesn't stop the houses, Clara. It only means that when the water meadow floods into somebody's kitchen in 5 years, you'll have the moral satisfaction of an unsold bookshop. I came here to make you whole. He straightened his coat. Friday. The offer dies. Friday at noon, and it will not be made again. And one day, I genuinely believe this, you'll understand that I was, for the second time, the only person in your life telling you the truth. He walked up towards the wheat sheaf. Clara stood with her key in the lock and her heart going hard. Not with doubt, she was pleased to note, examining it. Not one grain of doubt, but with the specific fury of hearing a threat dressed as a kindness, twice in one lifetime, from the same mouth. She went in, lit the lamp, 9 a.m, broad daylight, she didn't care, it felt liturgical, and telephoned the vicar. What followed was 10 days that the parish magazine would later call, with Peggy's editorial hand all over it, the Battle of the Water Meadow. It was fought, as such battles are in England, with agenda items. Thomas Milton, mild as milk, and suddenly nobody's lamb, requested the diocese's own flood risk assessment for the glebe and discovered there wasn't one. Frank of the British Legion, who turned out to have been a quantity surveyor for 40 years, took James's highways consultant scheme apart culvert by culvert in a letter to the district council that was 17 pages long and cited the drainage records back to 1911, which the church, as it happened, possessed, because the church possessed everything, in a vestry chest under the hassocks. Asha Chandra found the covenant. That was the thunderclap. It was Beatrice, of course. It was always Beatrice. In 1987, quietly, at the height of an earlier scare, Beatrice Whitcombe had gifted the 2 riverside paddocks she owned to the parish, and the deed of gift carried a restrictive covenant in language she had reportedly dictated to the solicitor herself. The land to be held for the benefit of the parish as open flood meadow in perpetuity, that the waters may have somewhere to go, as must we all. The access roads, every route crossed one paddock or the other. The vicar read the covenant aloud to the parish council, and then, because he was a better man than his opponents, read it again, slowly, for the Halloran and Vane representative taking notes at the back, and added kindly, "That's in perpetuity, with a P, if it helps." Clara heard the whole story that evening from 4 separate sources before Adam reached the shop, last of all, at dusk, still in his work jacket, with mud to the knee and the news shining in him like the lamp itself. "It's dead," he said, before the bell had finished ringing. "The scheme. Stone dead. Halloran's pulled out. Their man was on the phone in the Wheat Sheaf car park an hour, Frank says, and the word covenant featured prominently." He stopped in the middle of the shop and laughed. She'd never heard him laugh, not fully, and it changed his whole face, took 10 years and 1 advent off it. 39 years ago. She laid this up 39 years ago, like winter fodder, and told nobody, and it's held. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor. Strength and honour are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. He shook his head slowly. Proverbs 31. Milton's preaching it Sunday, and there won't be a dry eye between here and Stowe. And James? Gone. Checked out this afternoon. He left something for you at the pub. Adam held it out, a cream envelope, her name in the familiar hand. No X, she noted. Inside, 1 line. "You were right about the leverage. I'm sorry, for all of it." Clara read it twice, and found, testing the place where the wound had been, as you test a mended tooth, mostly scar, and under the scar, unexpectedly, something that had stopped hurting and started merely aching the way old truths do. "Forgive us our debts," she said, and put the note in the drawer with the paper clips and the dead offers and closed it without ceremony. Zeroed each January, red ink, it's the house style. Adam watched her do it. The lamp hissed. Outside, the first true frost of the year was stiffening the high street, and the sky over the wolds had gone the deep, clean violet that promises stars. "Clara," he said, "it's daylight tomorrow." Her heart performed a maneuver entirely without precedent. It generally is. 7:30. It gets light. I'll be done feeding by 9. He turned his cap in his hands, one full revolution, and looked up, and there was nothing in his face now but the plain, wide-open weather of a man done wintering. "Walk up Hartsfoot Hill with me. There's a thing on the top I want to show you, and a thing I want to say, and I've a mind to do both in the biggest daylight in the parish." "Yes," said Clara Whitcombe, before he had entirely finished the sentence, and Adam Brier laughed for the second time in one evening, and the lamp burned in the window of the lantern like something kept and keeping. Chapter 9. The Hawthorn. The morning came up like the first morning of the world. Frost silvered every blade and branch of the valley. The Wyle ran glittering and chastened under the bridge. The smoke stood straight up from the village chimneys into a sky scrubbed blue to the very top. Clara climbed the Hartsfoot track at 9 with her breath pluming and her heart in her mouth, and Adam met her at the yard gate with Bess at his heel, and neither of them managed anything more eloquent than "morning," which under the circumstances carried the approximate weight of a sonnet. They walked up through the fields, through his ewes, who regarded Clara with the flat suspicion of 40 chaperones, through a hanging beechwood rhymed white and utterly silent, and out at last onto the open crown of the hill, where the whole of the country lay below them. The village in its fold, the church tower, the river, the water meadow that would now be meadow forever, the shining threads of lanes, and away, the wolds rolling blue to the edge of sight. And on the very top of the hill, alone in a fold of turf, stood a hawthorn tree. It was old, older than old. The trunk was a twist of grey iron a man's arms couldn't circle, wind-carved, leaning away from the west like everything on that hill, and every thorned twig of it was furred with frost, so that it stood burning white against the blue, a bush of cold fire. "My grandfather said it was here before the church," Adam said. "There's them that say the parish boundary was walked from this tree, time out of mind. It flowers in May, like the snow come back, and the smell of it goes down to the village on a warm evening." He put his hand on the iron trunk, easy, familiar, a man greeting an elder. "I was christened down there, married down there, and buried her down there. And every one of those days, before and after, I've come up here. Beatrice knew. Nobody else." He looked at the tree, not at her, and his voice went down to its foundations. "The day of Emily's funeral, I came up in the sleet and told God I was done. Not with believing. I hadn't the imagination to stop believing. More's the pity. It would have been simpler. Done with hoping. I told him he could have the farm, and the flock, and my Sundays, and the Hall Roof Fund, and he could leave me be. And I heard nothing back, because that's not how it works, whatever folks say. There was just the tree, standing the sleet, like it stood the gale last week, like it stood 900 years of everything this hill could throw. He was quiet a moment. It's a thorn tree, Clara. It's made of thorns, and it flowers like a bride, every May, regardless. I'd sit up here and I couldn't argue with it. That was the sermon. That was the whole sermon. 3 years, one tree, regardless. Clara stood in the frost with her eyes stinging and did not dare to breathe. Then a van came up the Foss Road in the rain, Adam said, with London plates driven very badly. He turned from the tree and faced her and took off his cap, on a hilltop in November, bareheaded before her and the parish and the sky. And the smile came the whole long way, arriving at last with everything it had carried. I'm not a clever man with words. I've been drafting this since the harvest supper and it's still got mud on it. But here's the daylight, and here's the whole order of service. He took her cold hands in his warm ones, deliberate, exact, a man laying a foundation course. I love you, Clara Whitcombe. I love you the way that tree flowers, out of old wood, past all sense, regardless. I loved you by the third bucket, I think, before ever I saw your face. Beatrice read me your letters, you see, years of them, and I used to think, God forgive me, the man that gets those letters. And then you stood on a stage with her Bible and bound yourself to my village out of the Book of Ruth. And I sat on that bench and thought, there she is. There's the flower on the thorn. His hands tightened on hers, very slightly, the single unbudgeted expense. I've a working farm and a museum of a house I've not had the courage to change, and grief that'll walk beside us some days like an old dog. I'll not pretend otherwise. I'm asking anyway. Not for an answer wrung out of a storm or a rescue, for one made in daylight, with the ledger open. Will you court with me, Clara? Proper. Slow as I do everything. Sundays in daylight and the whole village watching, and at the end of it, if the flower holds, a ring, and that church down there, and the rest of my mornings. The wolds lay shining. Bess sat on the frost with her head cocked. Somewhere below, faint and clear, the church clock struck the half-hour. Adam Brier, Clara said, when she could trust her voice. I have been proposed courtship on a rooftop in London by a man with a hired photographer, and it was less romantic than watching you deliver a lamb. Yes. Yes to Sundays. Yes to daylight. Yes to the old dog, and the slow work, and the whole village watching. Yes. And the laugh broke through the tears, up from underneath everything. Whither thou goest. I did the reading. I know how it ends. She marries the farmer, Adam. She gleans one field and marries the farmer. It's the whole point of the book. And then she stopped talking because he kissed her. He did it the way he did everything, without hurry, without flourish, one hand rising to her jaw where it had rested once before in a candlelit hall, the other still holding hers against his chest, where she could feel his heart going like the while in flood under all that stillness. And it was brief, and it was chaste, and it was seismic. It went through her, like the gale through the valley, and left her rearranged. Frost, blue sky, thorn tree, the smell of hay and rain, and him. She would be able to summon every article of it at will for the rest of her life. When he drew back, the full and proper distance, farm formal, his forehead resting one last, unbudgeted moment against hers, they were both unsteady as new lambs, and both laughing, quietly, at nothing, at everything. Stir not up love till it please, Adam murmured, gravel and wonder. It pleases, Lord, but it pleases. You realize, Clara said, against his shoulder, that we now have to walk back down through the village, at 10:30 in the morning, looking like this. Aye. He settled his cap back on and offered her his arm like something out of a ballad, and his ears were scarlet, and his face was the sun. I'm counting on it. 3 years they've prayed me down off this hill. Let them see what the Lord dragged up it instead. They came down the track, arm in arm, into Nether Wyckham at 11, past the post office, where Asha Chandra dropped a full tray of pension forms, past the wheat sheaf, past the flower committee in the churchyard, who abandoned all pretense and simply stood among the chrysanthemums and beamed. And by noon, as forecast, it was round 3 parishes, and at 1 o'clock, Peggy Pruitt entered the lantern without preamble, kissed Clara on both cheeks, said, "Finally. The committee had a book running since the harvest supper, and I've won £4, and burst into tears among the paperbacks. That night, Clara lit the lamp and looked up the hill, and Hartsfoot's light burned back, and between the two of them the whole frosty village lay strung like a rosary, house by house by house. Morning by morning, she thought. New mercies, as advertised. Chapter 10. Advent. They courted, as promised, slow. It became, within a fortnight, a village institution, conducted under the benevolent supervision of the entire parish, and governed by rules nobody had written down and everybody enforced. Adam came to the shop on Tuesdays and Fridays at closing, and did the sums for the cafe conversion, and stayed to supper upstairs precisely as long as respectability allowed, which Peggy Pruitt had apparently gazetted at 9:30. Clara went up to Hartsfoot on Saturdays and learned the farm, learned to work Bess on the whistle, badly, learned the ewes by their faces, which Adam swore to and she half believed, learned to drive the Land Rover on the fields, to universal peril. On Sundays, they sat in church, he in the churchwarden's pew, and she in the third from the front, pulpit side, across the aisle and one row apart, which was somehow more intimate than sitting together would have been. All through Advent, she sang the treble line and leaned and the baritone held, and half the congregation watched them not watching each other with an indulgence that ought to have been unbearable, and was instead like being warmed at a great fire. The courting had weather in it too. She would not have believed before how much of love was the management of a nearness you had chosen not yet to close. There was an evening in the shop, hanging the Christmas garland, when she came down the stepladder into his waiting hands, and his grip stayed at her waist a moment past necessity, and the moment stretched, and shone, and hummed like a wire in wind, before he stepped back and became extremely interested in the structural integrity of the garland. There was an afternoon in the barn, feeding orphan lambs shoulder to shoulder on a straw bale, when she looked up from the bottle to find him watching her with an expression so undefended that she had to look away first, and neither of them said anything, and the lamb finished its bottle in a silence you could have lit lamps from. There were the partings at the shop door, twice a week, that grew a half-second longer each time, his hand at her jaw, one kiss, unhurried, at the outer boundary of what the flower committee, who were never visibly present and never entirely absent, would have certified. And then the deliberate step back, the cap, the good night, Clara, in the voice with the gravel in it, and the sound of his boots going up the frosty street while she leaned against the inside of her own door, like a girl of 17. "It's the waiting," she told the Beatrice voice one such night, laughing at herself, breathless in her own hallway. "Nobody warns you the waiting is like this. It's not deprivation at all. It's the opposite. It's Advent." "Well, of course it is," said the Beatrice voice, unimpressed. "Why do you think the church invented it? All the best things arrive at the speed of a pregnancy. Now go and do your accounts." But there was a harder weather in the courting too, and it arrived, as Adam had promised it would, like an old dog, quiet, loyal to its habits, and lying down across the middle of December. Emily Brier had died on the 14th, the third Sunday of Advent, 3 years past. Clara knew the date from the churchyard, where she had stood once, alone, in her second week in the village, before any of this, and read the stone. Emily Ruth Brier, beloved wife, she is not dead but sleepeth, and had thought, not knowing yet whose grief it was. Somebody tends this daily. Now the date came on like a headland out of fog, and she watched Adam go quiet by degrees through the second week of December, not cold, never cold, but inward, his sentences shortening, the smile making only part of its long journey. And she lay awake asking the question that every second love must ask, and none is owed an answer to. She did not ask it aloud. Instead, on the 13th, she closed the shop at 4, filled a basket, and walked up Hartsfoot Hill through the blue dusk, and found him, as she had known she would, as Beatrice must once have found him, in the churchyard on her way, standing bareheaded by the stone with the light going. She stopped at the lich gate. She would have turned back. It was his. She had no wish to trespass twice on the same grief. But he turned and saw her, and something in his face opened rather than closed, and he put out his hand to her across the churchyard, across the whole of it. And Clara walked up the path between the frosted graves and took it, and stood with him in front of Emily's stone in the last of the light, her hand in his, saying nothing, for a long time. "She'd have liked you," Adam said at last. "I want to say it plain, because folk dance round it, and the dancing's worse. She was quick, like you. Laughed at me the same way. She'd have been in that shop every day of her life, and the two of you would have run this village between you inside a year." His thumb moved once over Clara's knuckles. "I'll not pretend she's a closed book, Clara. There's no closing it. But I've learned the thing I couldn't learn for 3 years, and it took a bookshop woman to teach me, so you may as well hear it at the source." He looked at the stone, and his voice was steady and clear as the frost. "Love's not a ledger. It doesn't balance one column against another. It's the loaves and the fishes. You give it all away and turn round and the baskets are full. Loving you hasn't taken a crumb from her. There's more of me now than there was. That's the arithmetic, and it's his, not mine, and I've stopped auditing it." Clara pressed his hand and reached into her basket and took out the thing she had brought and had half feared to bring. A jar of white blossom, dried, hawthorn, from the tree on the hill, gathered in some May by Beatrice and found by Clara in the still room of the shop, labelled in copperplate, Hartsfoot Thorn, for remembrance. She set it on the stone below the beloved and stepped back. Adam looked at it for a long moment. Then he put his arm around her, there in front of his wife and his God and the lit windows of the village below, and pressed his lips to Clara's hair and said, wrecked and mended in the one breath, "Aye, that's the whole order of service." They walked down through the dark to the shop, and she fed him supper, and at 9:30 exactly he stood and put on his cap and paused at the door. "Christmas Eve," he said. "Midnight service. Sit with me?" Not across the aisle, not one row apart. The churchwarden's pew before the whole gathered parish at the turning of the year. "Whither thou goest," said Clara Whitcombe, and kissed him across the threshold, 1/2 second past the certified boundary, and closed the door on his laughter into the frost. The cafe opened the Saturday before Christmas, Davy Fox having hung the connecting door with 2 days to spare, and Nether Wyckham, presented with books, coffee, and somewhere to be, responded like the desert to rain. Asher's machine hissed like a happy dragon. The book club colonized the back room. The school walked its children down, crocodile fashion, to a story hour Clara had improvised in panic and would now perform weekly until she died, apparently, by order of persons aged 6. Old Mr. Tetlow took up residence in the wing chair by the theology section with the air of a man come into his kingdom, and paid, as ever, in kindling, and was carried on the books, as ever, in red ink. And on the Sunday, the vicar preached on the lilies again. He was a man of 2 sermons a year, Adam said fondly, but they were good ones. And afterwards at the coffee, he drew Clara aside, polished his glasses, and delivered the last surprise of Beatrice's estate. "The covenant deed," he said. When Asher found it, there was a letter folded in with it, in the vestry chest, sealed. Addressed, he held it out, "To my great-niece Clara, when she has remembered. I've been carrying it 3 weeks, waiting to be sure you had." He smiled, woolly and wise. "I watched you sing this morning. You've remembered." Clara opened it that night, upstairs, by the window where the lamplight rose from below. 1 page, copperplate. "Dear Clara, if Thomas has given you this, then the meadow is safe, the shop is lit, and you have stopped writing me Christmas cards with 2 lines of biro, which is more than I dared pray for and exactly what I prayed for every night, at the going down of the sun. I have no advice. Advice is what we give instead of trust. I will say only this. I have watched two people I love stand in the same rain for years, each thinking it was theirs alone. If by some kindness of Providence you have got yourselves under the one umbrella by the time you read this, and I have left the weather every encouragement, then mind you hold it properly. Two are better than one, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. And the third strand, child, is not a secret. It is the whole trick, and you know his name. The lamp oil is under the stairs. It always will be if you see to it. Your loving aunt, Beatrice. P.S. Tell Adam the flashing on the church porch wants doing. He'll know I mean it as a blessing. Chapter 11. Midnight and Morning. Christmas Eve in Nether Wyckham was conducted according to a liturgy older than the prayer book. At 4, the children's crib service, at which a Wilson shepherd hit an angel with his crook, and theology was felt to have been served. At 6, the wheat sheaf, wall to wall, everyone home for the holiday, the low beams hung with holly, and the talk rising like bread. And at 11:30, the whole village put on its coats and climbed the hill to St. Mary's through a night gone still and enormous, the stars thick as blossom over the black shoulder of Hartsfoot, every window along the high street lit, and the bells, frank among the ringers, sworn off the mulled wine till after, pouring their changes down the valley like something spilled from a great height and gladly. Clara walked up with Asher and her Cambridge daughter, and at the church door Adam was waiting, in the good tweed, with the parish's candles to give out, because the churchwarden serves even on the night he'd rather have both hands free. He gave Clara hers last, and lit it from his own, cupping the flame between them against the doorway's draught, and the small fire passed from his wick to hers, with the two of them bent close about it like conspirators, and neither said anything, because there was nothing to say that the flame didn't. She sat in the churchwarden's pew. The whisper of it ran round the nave like wind in a barley field and settled into warmth. And at midnight, the lights went down and the church stood in the dark holding 200 small flames, and Thomas Milton's voice came out of the shadows by the crib, reading the oldest words of all. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid. Beside her in the dark, Adam Brier, shepherd, abiding of that same country, bowed his head. Clara took his hand. And when the carol came, O come all ye faithful, the treble leaned and the baritone held, and above them both the tenor bell rang on into the first minutes of Christmas. And Clara Whitcombe, 1 year almost to the day from the worst spring of her life, stood in a stone church older than England, holding a candle and a farmer's hand, and could not have listed her sorrows without notes. Joyful and triumphant she sang, meaning it, both words, in that order, which she understood at last was the whole art. The joy did not wait for the triumph. It came first, regardless. It was the flower on the thorn. Winter turned. January brought snow, and the school sledging down the glebe. Open flood meadow, in perpetuity, also excellent for toboggans, the Covenant being silent on the point. February brought the real lambing, and Clara spent her Saturdays in the barn until she could work a bottle lamb line like a native, and had names over Adam's dead body for half the flock. March brought the roof, Davy Fox re-leading the lantern under skies like wet slate, and the first anniversary of a wedding that hadn't happened, which Clara noted, examined, found to be entirely scar, and marked by taking the flower committee to lunch. And on Lady Day, the 25th of March, quarter day, when farm rents fell due and always had, a date with ledgers in its bones, Adam Brier came into the shop at closing with his cap in his hands and the air of a man who had drafted something since Christmas and got the mud off it at last. "I've been to see Milton," he said. "And Peggy," For the banns are no use without the flowers, I'm told, and I'd sooner face the diocese than the committee unbriefed. And I wrote to your mother. I wrote, Beatrice trained me, and I'll not apologise. And I've her blessing by return of post, and a good deal of underlining. He set on the counter, between the till and the red ink ledger, a small box that had been his grandmother's, and opened it, and the ring inside was old gold with a garnet the colour of the lamp's flame. It pleases, he said, hoarse and steady, the whole weather of him wide open. It's pleased since the third bucket. Clara Whitcombe, daylight, witnesses, ledger open, the shop trading, the meadow safe, and me on both my feet and asking, will you marry me? In May, when the thorn's in flower. Clara came round the counter, 3 feet of Victorian oak, and then nothing at all, ever again. Yes, she said. Yes, and Adam, the date, you glorious, deliberate man, you waited for quarter day. Aye, well. The ears went scarlet. The smile arrived with all its luggage. His hands, putting the ring on her finger, were not quite steady, which she treasured. New tenancy, said Adam Brier, whole heart, rent paid in advance, in full, in perpetuity. And he kissed her, unhurried, seismic, one hand at her jaw, and the lamp burning over the door. And outside in the dusk, a passing member of the flower committee stopped dead on the pavement, pressed both hands to her mouth, and ran, actually ran, witnesses confirmed, towards Peggy Pruitt's cottage with the news, and the bans, it was widely agreed, were a formality. The village had published them from its heart months since. They were read all the same, 3 Sundays running, from the lectern of St. Mary's. I published the banns of marriage between Adam John Brier of this parish and Clara Elizabeth Whitcombe of this parish. And at of this parish, the second time, Clara's eyes went suddenly and hopelessly to see, because there it was, in the oldest formula the church possessed. She was of this parish now, published and irrevocable, thy people, my people, the whole gospel, love that stays put. If any of you know cause or just impediment, said the vicar, why these 2 persons should not be joined together, ye are to declare it. 200 people held their peace, smiling. The tenor bell, unrung, hummed faintly in the tower, the way old bells do when the air is glad. Chapter 12. The time of the singing of birds. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of May, and the hawthorn, as contracted, was in flower. It had come out all along the valley in the last week of April, the hedgerows going white mile on mile, the May blossom heaped on the dark thorn like snow that had decided to stay and be happy about it. And on the crown of Hartsfoot Hill, the old tree burned white against the blue, exactly as Adam had promised. A bride of 900 springs, and the smell of it came down to the village on the warm evenings, sweet and wild, and got into everything, the shop, the church, the dreams of the betrothed. The morning of the wedding, Clara woke at 5 in the flat above the lantern for the last time as Clara Whitcombe, and could not stay in bed, and took her tea down into the sleeping shop and walked the aisles in her dressing gown, touching the shelves. Poetry, theology, dry as a bone under the new lead. The wing chair, the red ink ledger, the drawer with the paper clips, and the dead offers and one forgiven note. The lamp in the window, burning still from the night before, pale gold in the growing light. Well, Auntie B, she said, to the shop, to the lamp, to the whole means of remembering. You terrible, wonderful, scheming old saint. I hope you're both watching. I hope you've got good seats. The shop, being a shop, said nothing. But the sun came over the hill at that moment and lit the gilt letters in the bow window and threw the lantern backwards in gold across the floor and up Clara's dressing gown to her heart, which even a sensible woman may take as she likes on her wedding morning. She was dressed by Peggy and Asher and her mother, down from Yorkshire since Tuesday, already sworn into the flower committee as an overseas member, in ivory, plain and fine, nothing like the gown that had hung once in a London wardrobe and gone back whence it came. And she carried, at her own insistence and to the committee's initial horror and eventual weeping capitulation, hawthorn, a small sheaf of it, cut at dawn from the tree on the hill by the groom himself, thorns and all, wrapped at the stems in a page of copperplate. The letter, hold it properly, laminated by Davy Fox, who turned out to have depths. The whole village walked up. That was the thing she would remember. No cars, the day being fine. The entire parish climbing the hill to St. Mary's on foot in its wedding best. The bells going full peal, Frank sober as a judge on the tenor, the lane a river of hats. Old Mr. Tetlow was wheeled up by the Wilson's boy with a sprig of may in his cap. The school lined the churchyard path, ostensibly to sing, actually to stare. And at the door of the church, in the good tweed retired at last, and a new suit the colour of ploughland, stood Adam Brier, who had promised himself he would be composed, and who took one look at his bride coming up the path with thorn blossom in her hands and the sun behind her, and had to be steadied by his best man, Thomas Milton having flatly refused to let anyone else do it, and the curate from Stow taking the service, and was heard by the front 3 rows to say, in a wrecked whisper that entered the parish's permanent collection, "There she is." The service was the old one, at their joint insistence, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. Clara said it looking straight into the grey-green weather of his eyes, and understood that she had been wrong, all her London life, about those words. She had thought them a hedge of warnings. They were an inventory of treasure. For worse was a wedding gift. It meant you will not stand in the sleet alone. The curate read Ruth, of course, and then, because Adam had asked for it, and would say only that it was between him and the text, the Song of Solomon. My beloved spake, and said unto me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. For lo, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. The winter is past. Clara heard it with her hand in Adam's hand, and the ring, old gold, garnet, flame-coloured, going on beside its sister, and she thought of a man on a hilltop in sleet, telling God he was done with hoping, and of a woman in a solicitor's office, laughing so as not to weep, and of every mile of the 104 between London and the sheep in the lane, and she thought, he was doing a new thing the whole time. Behold, shall we not know it? Even in the wilderness away, even in the desert, rivers. They signed the register, Clara Elizabeth Brier, and her hand did not shake, though it took its time, and came down the aisle to Great is thy faithfulness, the whole parish singing, soggy to a man exactly as Beatrice had forbidden and foreseen, the treble and the baritone in the middle of it now, leaned and holding and leaned, and out into the sun, into the bells, into a churchyard snowed under with confetti. The committee had made all spring from dried hawthorn petals, so that the May blossom fell on them out of 200 hands, like the tree itself had come down the hill to see it done. The wedding breakfast was in the church hall, gingham and marrowless, pie and cider and 3 kinds of cake, and the speeches were a triumph, the vicar mild and devastating, Frank statistical, Peggy, self-appointed, Gavel improvised from a ladle, declaring that she had won a further £11 and considered the entire romance her personal project, with some assistance from the Almighty, who was working to my notes. Adam's own speech was 4 sentences long, the last of which was, She reads to my sheep, and they're better sheep for it, and so am I, and it flattened the room entirely. And in the blue dusk, when the dancing had begun and could be trusted to see to itself, the bride and groom slipped out, this too being liturgy, and walked up through the fields alone, through the ewes and the wide-eyed lambs, up through the hanging wood, loud with the singing of actual birds, to the crown of the hill, where the old thorn stood in its full white fire against the first stars, pouring sweetness downwind over the whole of their country. They stood beneath it, man and wife, her head on his shoulder, his cheek on her hair, the village lit below, the hall's windows gold with dancing, the lamp of the lantern burning over the empty street where Asher had lit it, unasked, because the lamp did not miss a night, ever, for anything, that being the whole point of a lamp. "Regardless," Clara said softly to the tree. "I," said Adam Brier, and turned her gently in his arms under 900 springs of blossom, and kissed his wife in the last of the light, unhurried, seismic, thorough as a man who has all the mornings of his life in hand and intends to be early for every one of them. And what they said to each other after that, up on the hill in the May dark with the blossom coming down, that is between them and the thorn and the one who makes all winters past. For there is a time to embrace and a time to write, and a wise book of this parish once ruled, in copperplate, on the matter of forced rhubarb. But it is recorded that they came down the track very late, and very slowly, by the long way, under the whole of the stars, and that the lamp was burning when they passed it, and that from that year to this, on the second Saturday of May, there has never once failed to be hawthorn on the counter of the lantern, thorns and all, in a jug of Emily's blue, set there before opening, always, by a farmer on his way up the hill, who stops a moment in the doorway of his wife's shop, cap in hand, as if the place were a church. Which, in the ways that matter most, it always was. Epilogue. Notes from the Lantern. Parish Magazine of St. Mary's, Nether Wyckham, May the following year. Our readers will forgive a short column this month, the columnist having been somewhat occupied. The cafe now opens at 8. Mr. Tetlow's chair is not for sale, for love nor kindling, and story hour moves to Thursdays by order of persons aged 7, formerly 6, who are advised that the management is not afraid of them. The book club will read Ruth in June, at the request of the churchwarden, who has developed opinions about literature and must be stopped. The committee is thanked for the christening flowers, which were of course hawthorn. Beatrice Ruth Brier arrived on May Day, at dawn, in something of a hurry. A family failing, her father observes, on the mother's side. She was born, as it happens, during lambing, and slept her first night in a farmhouse where the pencil marks on the doorframe have lately begun again, in a new hand, from the bottom. Her middle name requires no explanation in this parish. The lamp oil, as ever, is under the stairs. The lamp, as ever, is lit. Entreat me not to leave thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Ruth 1:16. The End.